Chapter 6 America's Preacher. Edric Everhart, a 45-year-old boyishly handsome man of slender build, had through luck and circumstance become the man of the hour. His thick black hair and engaging smile had helped make him a triple threat of media, church, and politics. His megachurch, aptly called Fort Jesus, comprised a 60,000-member congregation just outside of Dallas. Every Sunday, he broadcast live from Fort Jesus to 50 million viewers. Because his audience stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, he'd become known as America's Preacher. When he'd first begun his ministry, he'd preached a populist prosperity gospel. Every man a king, every woman a queen. His pitch had been, everything was possible according to one's level of faith in Santa God. In recent years, however, many whites across the country had become so discontented with their societal condition that he'd changed course. His majority white audience increasingly believed minorities were gaining too many advantages under the present system. If things kept going the way they were headed, they feared they'd soon lose their ruling majority. As a result, a fierce white nationalism had spread across the country. Everhart recognized a trend when he saw one and modified his message accordingly. Claiming that God had given him a vision for the future, he transformed from a shepherd into a Pied Piper. His revamped theology combined a New Age prosperity doctrine with Old Testament racist dogma. The blending of old-time religion with pride and country proved an exceedingly potent elixir. When mixed with Everhart's unique ability to deliver the message, the dogma had a most desirous effect. Extolling the virtues of biblical bondage not only served to intoxicate the flock, it also made him the undisputed champ of the discontented. Thanks to his folksy demeanor and good looks, he'd become a TV star while social media had transformed him into both the messenger and the message. In addition to the new approach gaining him a multitude of new adherents, it also garnered the attention of political right-wing think tanks. Chief among these was the conservative Washington, D.C.-based C Street Group, or as it's known to its members, the Family. The primary purpose of this invisible cadre of powerful government movers and shakers was to establish their agenda of Christian dominance among the highest-placed rulers in all the world. Recognizing Everhart's immense popularity, they solicited him to enter the upcoming presidential primaries as the Republican candidate. Everhart had never actually aspired to political office, but because he suffered from chronic vanity syndrome, the idea of being president appealed to him. Edric Everhart had a high opinion of himself despite his hard-scrabble beginnings. His mother, Lily, hailed from a lower-class Texas family and had conceived him at 17. His father, a career soldier, had been killed in action before they could marry. Delta Force Sergeant Major Billy Simmons Everhart had been training Salvadorian government troops in counterinsurgency when his position was overrun by the FMLN. When her parents learned the Sergeant Major was dead, they'd insisted Lily put the baby up for adoption. When she'd refused, they'd kicked her out of the house. Luckily, or so it seemed at the time, her father's sister took her in. The aunt, a retired elementary school teacher, lived in a trailer park in nearby Irving, Texas. On the surface, she appeared charitable, but behind closed doors, she treated Lily like a bondservant. The only reason she let Lily and the baby live with her was to claim them as dependents for tax and Social Security purposes. When Lily turned 21, she'd taken a waitressing job at a bar in nearby Oak Cliff. Edric was 5 years old the night she'd kissed him on the forehead, told him she loved him, and left. He'd never seen her again. Auntie, as Edric called his great aunt, rarely spoke of Lily. Whenever the subject came up, she'd only say that Lily had run off and wasn't coming back. Rumor had it she'd been murdered by a trick in a West Dallas motel. Years later, at Auntie's funeral, a woman whom Edric had never seen before sidled up next to him at the gravesite. As Auntie's casket was being lowered into the ground, the woman cupped her hand to her mouth and half whispered, "Your mother was a whore," and walked away. After that, he'd never gone back to Irving, but he'd always acknowledged it as the place where he got his start. Rather than enroll young Edric in the public school system that she knew so well, Auntie instead homeschooled him. But his real education had come in the form of Christian television. Every day, Auntie did three things: gossip, complain, and watch Christian TV. Edric's earliest memories were of shouters, pleaders, and people who babbled incoherently. As a toddler, he thought preachers had magic hands that could make people stand, sit, or fall over just by waving them. When he got older, Edric noticed that preachers never seemed to have any money. They talked nonstop about how God could do anything, but apparently the one thing God couldn't do was give them money. People had to do that, and they did. Cash was scarce around the trailer. There wasn't much available for new toys or clothes, but Auntie could always manage to scrape together something for her favorite preachers. The trailer was a menagerie of cheap trinkets sent by Grateful Ministries in return for her love offerings. Over the years, she donated thousands of dollars to their ministries, yet all the trinkets combined weren't worth $100. But Auntie didn't care. She considered the joy she got from her programs to be priceless. She knew just about every Anglo-Christian song ever written, and even though she sounded like a wounded wildebeest, she sang along with all of them, all day, every day. Young Edric started joining in when he was still in diapers. Then, one Sunday, when he was around 7 years old, Auntie took him to an actual church. Faith Temple Foursquare Pentecostal Church was led by Pastor Bill Fredericks. Fredericks was a dynamic man who preached in the classic Pentecostal charismatic style. He had a flair for the dramatic and was sometimes more than a little animated. Edric was sitting in the front pews when the choir started singing Onward Christian Soldiers. When Pastor Bill strode into the pulpit, he looked more like a GQ model than a preacher. Dressed in a white polo shirt and beige chinos, he'd faced the congregation and raised his arms. Auntie fairly floated out of her seat. Edric's little feet didn't reach the floor, and he'd hop down as the congregation stood and began enthusiastically singing along. Edric was so impressed by the singing that years later he would adopt Christian Soldiers as his For Jesus TV theme song. Pastor Bill noticed little Edric's enthusiastic singing right away, but it was the 7-year-olds correcting him that really got his attention. Pastor Bill was teaching on the subject of healing when he stated, "As Jesus was returning from Judea, 2 blind men called out to him." Suddenly, a tiny voice rang out.
"Jericho! Jesus was coming from Jericho when he healed the blind men."
Pastor Bill stopped mid-sentence. After a moment, he started to laugh. Although embarrassed, the pastor recovered gracefully and extolled the congregation.
"All right, church, say it with me."
The congregation responded in unison.
"Out of the mouths of babes."
That morning, Faith Temple fell in love with Edric, and from then on, Auntie brought him to church every Sunday. Pastor Bill instantly recognized the precocious progeny's potential and took him under his wing. By the time Edric was 9 years old, he was teaching Sunday school and leading youth services. Auntie reveled in the reflected attention and treated Edric like a prince from then on. Then, one Sunday, things took a seminal turn. After serving the church for more than 50 years, the beloved Deacon Cheeks died. He'd been a member of the church since long before Bill Fredericks ever came along. Every Sunday, rain or shine, he'd stood in the vestibule's wide cedar doors greeting the congregants while issuing orders to all the ushers. His passing had marked an end to an era and cast a visceral pall over the assembly. Pastor Bill thought young Edric might be just the thing to brighten the church's mood. So it was that 8-year-old Edric Everhart came to preach his first Sunday morning sermon. He'd captured their hearts the moment he'd stepped up on the milk crate placed behind the lectern. Peeking over the rostrum, he barely reached the microphone. Choosing his text from the book of Ecclesiastes, he spoke loud and clear.
"To everything there's a season, and a time to every purpose unto heaven."
He took the mic from its stand and stepped off the crate, his squeaky voice sounding ever more endearing as he regaled the
"A
congregation.
time to be born, and a time to die."
He strode back and forth in the pulpit, his little head bobbing like a baby chick. Peering into the pews, he'd enchanted the church with visions of Deacon Cheeks. He reminded them that they shouldn't be sad because the deacon had been a good and faithful servant who'd gone home to his reward.
"Can't you just see him? There he is, surrounded by the Shekinah, bright, shining as the sun. He's up there in heaven right now, looking down on us, and oh, he's smiling. He's smiling because he's wrapped in the warm, loving arms of Jesus."
By the time he'd finished, the entire church was on its feet. Hands stretched up, tears fell down, all the while joy and praise rose to heaven. After that, people came from all over whenever he spoke. He proved especially effective at raising money. As the choir would softly sing Bringing in the Sheaves, he'd strut to the front of the pulpit and call for the ushers to prepare the baskets. Raising his little hands over his head, a smile beaming from his cherubic baby face, he'd sing.
We will come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves.
As the baskets passed among the pews, he'd repeat,
Will a man rob God? Will a man rob God? Hallelujah.
He'd go on like that until the collection was finished. The tactic proved so effective that he'd used it long after he'd stopped believing in God.